I'm not sure we talk enough about failures in internal controls, but today I want to take up a single override failure which was so catastrophic it caused an FCPA enforcement action. The compliance tip of the day. This is the podcast where we bring you daily insights and practical advice on navigating the ever-evolving landscape of compliance requirements. Whether you're a seasoned compliance professional or just starting your journey, my aim in this podcast is to provide you with a bite-sized, actionable tip to help you stay on top of your compliance game. And now I'd like to say a few words about the latest podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network, AI Today in 5 with 5. Thrilled to announce the inaugural episode of my latest podcast series, AI Today in 5. I wanted to do a short, curated set of stories and news stories about AI for the compliance professional and the greater business professional. You can check it out on Megaphone, the Compliance Podcast Network, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or Apple, or wherever great podcasts are listened to. Check out AI Today in 5. You can certainly override internal controls, but it's absolutely critical that you document the reason for the override. And if you don't, you can not only have a failure of internal controls, but it can violate the FCPA because clearly you don't have effective internal control. So what happens if you override an internal control and you don't document it in any way? Well, unfortunately for Halliburton, this is exactly what they did. They had a third party they wanted to hire or bring on as an agent, and that third party could not get through the third party due diligence requirements of the company. So what did Halliburton do? Well, it decided to bring this particular third party in as a vendor on the supply chain side of things, which had a different set of requirements, not as robust due diligence, but it had its own set of internal controls. The problem with this was that moving to the supplier process required certain internal controls to be followed, and these were not followed because the internal controls process around using a supplier had a competitive bidding process. Of course, whoever wanted to bring this corrupt agent in did not want the company to have to go through that process. So there was an override which allowed this particular vendor, to come in as a sole source supplier. Halliburton's internal controls required that when a sole source was used, it had to be justified, which makes a lot of sense. This justification would have required a showing of preference for quality, technical, execution, or other reasons, none of which was demonstrated by this particular third party. Finally, if such a single source was used, the reason had to be documented, identified, and justified. None of this was done. And of course, this third party was then alleged to have engaged in bribery and corruption on behalf of the company. So were the internal controls circumvented or were they overridden? Whatever it was, as a result, the internal audit was kept in the dark about the transactions and did not examine the transactions which brought this third party in. This is a true example of an internal controls failure, but here the internal control failure actually violated the FCPA. So how many internal control failures were there? What were the number and what were the lessons for the compliance professional? Internal controls must be followed to be effective. This does not mean you cannot override internal controls. You can always override internal controls. The problem is you have to have a justification to do so. If you see a payment and you have a question, well, trust but verify. So what are today's 3 key takeaways? Number 1, internal controls must be shown to be effective. Number 2, circumvention and management override of internal controls must be documented to pass muster. And 3, internal controls must be tested and that testing verified with an independent source of investigation, i.e. an external auditor. That's that I'm happy to do for you, the compliance profession, is if you have a question or a series of questions you would like some compliance tips on, I'm happy to take any requests that you might want, certainly anonymize them, and give you a quick tip, either one quick tip or maybe a week's worth of quick tips. So if you have any tips you want about your compliance program, you can shoot me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This podcast was created and produced